Thank you. Okay, fun facts about me. I'm an Arizona native, married to an Arizona native, and I have 5 children, and I have my own elder law practice. I've been practicing for 20 years, and that's all I do. So all right, so I appreciate being able to speak on this topic today because I think it's very, very, very important. I facilitate a support group for the Alzheimer's Association, and we talk about this frequently. And we just had a situation where and you get very creative sometimes because it's hard to allow someone to maintain their independence as long as possible, but keep them safe. And weighing those two options can sometimes be very tricky and sometimes requires a lot of creativity. So she had disabled her husband's car by, getting under the hood and unplugging something. So he promptly, and it was this summer, so it was about 120 degrees. He promptly got on the road and walked down to the car lot and tried to buy a new car, and she had to stop that from happening. But this is a real. It's a real tricky situation. My grandmother was still driving in her 90s, and she was a good driver until she came to one of our parties and said, "So I was driving on Central, and somebody started pounding on the roof of my car because she was driving in the reversible lane, and and it's hard when you're retired and you're not paying attention to know exactly what time it is, to know which way to be driving. And so there are complications and other things like that. She finally voluntarily stopped driving after that happened. So these are really big, hard decisions. So I'm excited to speak to you about this. I had clients in my office yesterday who wanted to come, and they said, if we come, will they take our name and do a test on us and take our licenses? And I said, no. So the good news is that Arizona is used to having a lot of retired individuals, and so we are pretty liberal in our laws. So we're going to walk through some of that today. Okay. So it's important to remember that driving is not a right. You do not have a right to be able to drive. It is a privilege, which is different. And that privilege has to be overseen and monitored with what is safe. So as long as it's safe, you have the privilege of driving, but not necessarily a right to drive. So in Arizona, we renew, once someone turns 60, that triggers a 5-year time period. Up until that point, you can have your driver's license renewed for up to 30 years. And once you hit 60, then they start this 5-year requirement where you have to come in and have an eye test. So other than that, someone asked a question in the restroom about if there's an age, and there is no age where you will have your driver's license taken away or you can no longer have a driver's license. It strictly depends on can you pass that sight test. There are no required written tests and there's no required road test unless there's been an incident that someone has reported where there was unsafe driving. So you can walk in, do your eye test, renew your license for 5 more years, and continue to do that until you're however long you need to. Now, and I think sometimes people are concerned when they get that initial dementia diagnosis that their driver's license will be revoked. So having a diagnosis of dementia does not mean that your license will be revoked, and doesn't necessarily mean that you're not a safe driver, especially in the beginning stages. So that it depends on your specific situation. So these are the lists of medical diagnoses that the Motor Vehicle Department uses to indicate who may or may not be a safe driver. So if any of these conditions apply, then there may be a deficit in your ability to safely drive. So those include epilepsy, arthritis, vision impairments, dementia, substance abuse issues, and neurological diseases. And in Arizona, the Motor Vehicle Department has the ultimate authority to decide, do you keep your license or do you not keep your license? So one of the hard questions is who to report and how that works. Because obviously if you're a caregiver, you take on enough heat most of the time in your caregiving, and as much as you can shove that off on someone else, that's a good idea. So an individual, and Arizona is not a mandatory reporting state. So I will have lots of clients say, the doctor knows that my husband can't drive, the doctor knows that he's been in 10 accidents, but he won't file a report with the Motor Vehicle Department. So we aren't, and that's legally, that is okay. Or sometimes spouses worry that if they know their spouse is not a safe driver and they don't report, that they could be legally responsible. You may be morally responsible for reporting that, but you cannot be held legally responsible for not reporting that. So an individual may report a driver condition or that someone's not a safe driver. Law enforcement may report someone, so you may be stopped. They may not give you a ticket, but they may choose to report that as an incident to Motor Vehicle Department. And a physician also may report. Now, obviously, it's nice to have the doctor report because he knows the medical diagnosis and it's probably a fairly accurate kind of sort of report. So we want to encourage that. And driving is it is almost directly related to how people feel independent. So when people's driving is restricted, people take that very seriously. So as you can imagine, sometimes people would want to sue someone who restricts their driving. So we do have immunity in Arizona for medical professionals who are willing to make those reports and those disclosures so that they don't worry about actually being sued. Now, they have other concerns. A lot of times I hear stories about the doctor filed a report with the Motor Vehicle Department, and now I have to go find a new doctor. So that's a different story. But actually being sued and having to hire an attorney to defend you because you wrote that report, it won't be an issue here in our state. And the physician's exam report is a Motor Vehicle Form 96-0668. If you want to suggest, because again, it's really nice for the caregiver to not have to do this. So if you printed that report out and you gave it to the doctor when you went in to see them, that kind of gives them permission and lets them know what you're trying to do and what your concerns are. And again, removes the blame from you. I don't know how that happened. I don't know, right? Okay. And again, the final determination of driving ability is made by the Motor Vehicle Department. So their considerations when they do these assessments, the things that they consider are history of incidents, inability to navigate familiar places, not observing traffic signs, slow or poor traffic decisions, so slow response time, inappropriate speed, angry or confused driving, vision impairments, cognitive limitations, and slow reaction times. So and a lot of times these are things that the neurologist or the actual physician will understand about someone's diagnosis. For example, someone who has frontal temporal dementia stands here, looks fine, talks with us. We don't know that there's a deficit in the frontal temporal lobe of their brain, but they can't understand consequences. So they stop at a stoplight. They're ready to go. They don't understand why everybody's taking so long because they're the 10th car. They will drive into the back of another car because they're ready to go. So the doctor and the physician would be the person in a position, well, the caregiver too, but in a position to medically be able to understand that diagnosis or something like that. Okay. So we are also very lucky where we live because you can kind of ease someone out of having their driver's license. We have a lot of options here. So we have restricted licenses where we can, if someone's struggling, and I hear people say this all the time, I only let them drive to the store and back, and they feel like that is safe. So you can, if this report is done and if you go through this process, you can be issued a restricted license where you have certain restrictions. Now those can include, you can only drive a golf cart. Now I'm not really sure how that's helpful because if you're driving a golf cart poorly, you don't really stand a chance in an accident. And I have had several clients die in golf cart accidents. So be really careful with that. Limited driving, like only drive during the daytime. And some people self-impose these restrictions because they know. And some people don't. They have to be told, obviously. Also, no freeway driving. Or you can actually have a restricted driver's license that says you can drive within 5-mile radius of your home. And that makes sense because if you lose your long-term memory last and you've lived in a place for a long period of time, you are comfortable with your routes typically and knowing where you are and where you need to go within a certain radius. So these are options to kind of ease someone into it who's very independent and very aggressive about not giving this up. Those are none of your loved ones, right? Right. Or no freeway driving. Okay. So some of the legal questions that I get asked all the time are, so can a car insurer refuse to insure you once you have a dementia diagnosis? And the answer is yes, because they can refuse to insure anyone. But I have never seen that happen. Typically what happens is after the third or fourth accident, they kind of get a clue what's going on and they raise your rate so high that you can't afford it. But they usually, and they're happy to insure you as long as you pay them an inordinate amount of money. But, and be careful because sometimes that will trigger a knee-jerk reaction of going out and taking your loved one off your policy. And sometimes that will jack up your policy to more than it was because there's a lot of discounts and things like that for double drivers. And I think there's an assumption on their part that if you're living together, the actual probability of you being able to stop that person from getting in a car if they want to is probably not good, and they're probably going to do it anyway, even if they're not on your insurance. So a lot of times if you cancel, your rates will be actually sometimes more. So just, explore that before you remove them off the policy. Now you could, when I was researching this and talking to different insurers about it, you could have a clause in the small print of your contract with your car insurer. But how many of you have read the small print of your contract? I don't even think I've ever seen mine, but you could. I mean, obviously, this is something that's on the forefront of most of your minds because you're here. So the next time you get a copy of your auto insurance policy, you can look at it and see if there's a disclaimer in there about terminating services or anything like that. Okay, and my concern always is that Arizona is what's called a contributory negligence state. So this has not happened yet, but my concern is always when there's an accident or when there's an injury, we fall back on, well, it's probably not a situation where one person is 100% at fault and one person is 0% at fault. So we assign blame in percentages. So it's not impossible that someone finds out you have a dementia diagnosis, and even though there was no actual fault, because you have that diagnosis, you could be 20% at fault or 30% at fault because you had an accident and you shouldn't have been on the road, and the other person is 70% at fault. So you have to be really careful and take that into consideration when you're trying to make this decision about if you want to continue driving. And like I said, up till now, I haven't had an insurer tell me that this has become an issue, but it's very possible, and it would be legal right now. Okay, so if someone's license is revoked, because what happens is the doctor sends in that letter, and then what happens is you get a letter. Someone sent us this letter. They're concerned about your driving. You have 30 days to respond. If you don't respond, we're revoking your license. So in that time period, you have a right to go to an administrative law judge and have a hearing. And you can say, I think the doctor's wrong, and this is why. Now, if you say, I think the doctor's wrong, and this is why I should be able to drive, and I'm a great driver, and you just say that, is the administrative law judge probably going to say, fine, you can have your license, I love you? That's probably not going to happen. But if you go get an independent driving test, and you present that to the administrative law judge, because I've done this a couple times with clients, and that administrative driving test or independent driving test says that you can respond appropriately and things like that. And they're not using standards of a 22-year-old. So it is possible to pass this test. And then the administrative law judge will allow you to continue driving as long as there's no incidences that are, egregious or something like that. Okay. And there is such a thing as a mandatory revocation. So if you've done something so egregious that, it's very obvious that you should not be driving, it can be a mandatory revocation where you don't have the opportunity to go to an admin law judge. Okay. So is a power of attorney agent, this is the question I get asked often, if you're a power of attorney agent for someone and you're their caregiver and you can't stop them from driving, are you legally responsible for them getting behind the wheel? What do you think? No, you are absolutely not. Power of attorney's responsibility is to make decisions for that individual and try to keep them safe, but they still have their own autonomy, and you have no legal obligation to try to do that. Now, again, it might be a moral obligation, but it is not a legal obligation. And so this is what I always, it's interesting. I had a client who would come into my office and she would never remember, like I would find her in the parking lot looking for her car an hour later, and her daughter would let her drive her grandchildren around, and she would show up at their house with like dents in her car, and the mom would say, I don't know what happened, and the kids would be terrified. So I think you have to look at it from two perspectives. We want people to be able to maintain their independence as long as possible. We don't want to prematurely stop anyone from driving. But if it's your grandkids that are walking across the street and going to school and someone's on the road and they don't see them, that's your grandchildren. So you have to weigh that in your mind, and everybody has a different place they come out with that, but you have to always morally consider those decisions. So congratulations for coming and talking about that today. If you have any questions, I do not have a table. I have lots of cards, though. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.